Hello and welcome to Zoom with Czarny. I'm Dustin Czarny, Democratic Elections Commissioner for Onondaga County. Today is Groundhog's Day, Thursday, February 2nd. And this is my interview show where I talk to candidates and democracy advocates in and out throughout Onondaga County and New York State. Today's guest is Christine Wood. She is been on the program before, Syracuse resident and a national leader with the group Public Citizen, which is doing voting rights work, not only here in New York State, but also throughout the entire nation. We have a great discussion on how it's like to do this voting rights work with a House Republican, party that is not interested in doing any federal legislation, and what's going on in other states. So stay tuned for that discussion. I'm very happy to say that our registration project here at the Board of Elections and going to the new registration system is ongoing. We hope to have some updates later next week. The New York State budget came out on February 1st yesterday, at least the governor's budget. And we'll be discussing that next week as I get a little bit more time to digest that. But check that out. There's not really a lot in there for elections right now. It usually comes when the legislators get their hand on the budget and add things that they want. So we'll have to see how that goes. But that's really all that's going on in election world. Soon we will have nominees for public office from the major parties, and petitions will start in March. So things will start picking up pretty soon. So stay tuned for my interview with Christine Wood, a public citizen. Enjoy. Bye. And I'm back with my good friend, Christine Wood. I've known Christine for quite some time, but she is the co-director of the Declaration for American Democracy for Public Citizen. And when you see me making trouble out on the federal building, it's usually because Christine has asked me to be there. And so, Christine, thanks for coming on Zoom with Czarny.
Yeah, of course. Excited to be on and talk all things democracy today.
So, Christine, when we had you on last year, we still had hope for some federal legislation. You're a big advocate for the For the People Act. You were working on that. We had hoped that if we had retained the House and maybe expanded the Senate, that we might have some avenues here. And while we expanded the Senate, we only expanded by one, and we actually lost the House now. So how is Public Citizen reacting to that? What are you changing your focus? What's going on?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Well, a few things that I want to lift up. One is that the fight to pass federal legislation continues. Anyone who's worked or even studied democracy issues and the fight for the freedom to vote knows that it's always been a long-term fight since the civil rights movement onwards. It's always been years of the hard work of organizers and folks on the ground and communities across the country that have pushed us forward towards advancing and strengthening the freedom to vote. So even though we had a setback last year, we're not pausing or giving up. We do need to continue to build support so we can pass sweeping federal reforms at the soonest possible moment. But as you mentioned, we do have a new House Speaker McCarthy, who will, it'll be very unlikely if he brought the For the People / Freedom to Vote Act up for a vote. And we do need to find a way to overcome the filibuster or get up to 60 votes in the Senate. So we have to continue building towards that moment, but it looks like it will be a couple more years till we can pass the sweeping federal reforms that we need. But it's still a really important and urgent fight, and we still need to ensure that every representative is hearing from their constituents on this issue. But in the meantime, there are a few things we're working on. So number one is we're advocating for the Biden administration to issue executive orders where it makes sense. So while legislation is stalled in Congress, executive action is a tool that President Biden has at his disposal that can actually enact some incremental but very important reforms. A few of them could be creating a voting rights task force, that would liaise with folks at the state level to ensure that voters and election officials are protected. There's also things that the Biden administration could do to close the revolving door between lobbyists and White House officials and also members of Congress. So there's real reforms there that we could push forward. So we're continuing to advocate that the Biden administration uses the full power of the Oval Office to strengthen democracy. And then lastly, there's a lot of opportunity at the state level and in communities across the country to enact reforms. So, a few that come to mind: in Minnesota, they're pushing forward with a big sweeping democracy bill there. In Michigan, I know that advocates on the ground there are currently sorting through options for what they can advance at that level. And then states and communities across the country are also looking at money in politics. How can they enact disclosure requirements? How can they enact public financing of elections? As well as, we're always working to advance an amendment to overturn Citizens United. So what resolutions can we move there to move the needle on that?
Yeah, and I want to really dive into the state stuff because that's really exciting. A lot of stuff that's going on. I want to lift up New York. We actually have public financing starting this week or starting this year for the next round of governor elections. But we're not going to talk too much about New York because my last episode with Alec Lewis, go see that if you like it. I want to talk about New York politics. Lots of New York politics there. And I wanted this to focus on the federal level or what's happening in other states, because there is not much happening in the federal level. So talk to me a little bit about these state initiatives. I think Maryland, I saw, is looking at doing some stuff. Minnesota, Chicago is, or Illinois is, public finance. So sure. Can you kind of dive into a few of these things that are going around the country and how Public Citizen is helping make this happen?
Sure. Well, before I dive into what's happening now, I just want to highlight a few things that happened back in November that I think are exciting and show the enthusiasm and appetite from everyday Americans and communities across the country for reforms like fair elections and voting rights reforms. So this past November, there was a couple of ballot measures that we are watching really closely. One in particular was in Michigan. It was called the Promote the Vote ballot measure. And in this people-powered ballot measure that was led by grassroots organizations and leaders on the ground in the state of Michigan, it did a couple of things. One is it enacted just some basic standards for voting there to ensure that folks had greater access to the ballot by expanding voting rights in the state, including things like early voting. And then also, and importantly, it's legally enforced that the state legislature could not overturn presidential results by sending their own slate of electors at the certification for president, which is, asinine that we have to pass legislation like that, but that's where we're at. So we actually do want to push for that legislation everywhere we can. So when that was on the ballot, it performed better than any other ballot measure on the ballot in Michigan. So it continues to demonstrate that voters across party lines support these type of policies and are, showing up to the ballot box with democracy and freedom to vote, money in politics at the top of their minds. And that's why in the lead up to the midterms, we saw a couple high profile speeches from, President Biden himself that said that the battle for democracy was the battle for the soul of the nation. And poll after poll shows that democracy was kind of at the forefront of folks' minds when they voted this past November. So just want to highlight there just the sheer momentum behind these reforms, despite the blockage in the Senate that I would say is a cause of the problem of money in politics and other issues. But folks are showing out. So Michigan in particular, they just passed this sweeping reform ballot measure that's really expanding the right to vote. And now the advocates on the ground there have the ability to potentially pass more bold reforms. So I know they're looking at a few different options for what they can do. And when a state is in that position, a few things that they can consider. Has their state passed a Voting Rights Act, like we did in New York State? Have they enacted fair elections, like we've done in New York State? Have we passed a resolution to overturn Citizens United? So those are a few things that I think are up in the air in a few different states, including Michigan, that folks are considering. I know that in Minnesota, they have a bill that's sort of modeled after the For the People Act. And one exciting thing in that bill is an expansion of their fair elections program, which would amplify the voices of everyday people through a campaign finance reform system. So that bill was introduced, I believe, last week. So we're really excited to help out there. And then a couple other reforms I'll mention. I know that New Mexico, they're looking at a New Mexico Voting Rights Act. So that's incredibly exciting and important there. And then a few municipalities, I think, are looking at passing fair elections. As a reminder, there's kind of two paths for campaign finance reform for fair elections. That is a voucher system like they have in Seattle, where you might be mailed democracy dollars that you can donate to a candidate of your choosing, or a small donor matching program like we have in New York State, which is a matching program. So essentially, if you're a candidate that's running for office, you agree to opt into this public financing system. Folks that donate to your campaign under a specific dollar amount, so let's say it's $200, their donation will be amplified by X amount. So let's say it's $7, then if they donated, $10 in your campaign, then an additional $70 would be matched. So what that does is it amplifies the voices of regular people, so that folks are fundraising from regular people as opposed to wealthy interests, corporate interests. So there's a few cities that passed those programs this past November. Oakland, California, and Portland, Maine, both passed fair elections ballot measures. Both of them performed extraordinarily well on the ballot, again, showing that when voters are able to directly vote on these policies to combat money in politics, they pass and folks are supportive. So now, as I mentioned, in addition to some of the states, there's a lot of movement in Maryland. Maryland already has passed a lot, and a lot of their municipalities has passed public financing programs. And I think that some of them are continuing to, the counties that have not passed it yet are considering it. And just earlier this week, Chicago had a hearing on public financing. So really exciting movement there. Of course, our goal is to pass these reforms at the federal level at some point. So there's standards that will help voters across the country, just because we do know that we don't want to leave people behind that might be in states where their legislature isn't advocating for these reforms or is blocking these reforms. But all of these victories at the municipal and state level demonstrate the support. They demonstrate that these systems are popular, that they work well, and they build towards our ability to pass them federally, so that in the meantime, while we are expanding voting rights and strengthening democracies at the municipal and state level, all of this will help add to our movement to pass at the federal level to ensure that everyone in the country can benefit from a functioning democracy.
So, I mean, I love to see that some of these things are being modeled after the For the People Act, which I was a big advocate for in doing them in the states. But obviously, the federal level is where we really need it, because we do have a lot of states not doing anything, or even doing, rollbacks. We've seen that in, luckily we've won some major elections in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the governor's races, that it's going to keep although Michigan actually flipped their legislature, so there's some opportunities there. But Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, we already see like the Republican legislators were salivating over winning the governor's mansion because they thought that they could roll back, some of the voting rights acts that have happened in those states, and those governors are going to protect it, but they're only going to protect it for another 4 years. And the southern states, we see scaling back of early voting in Georgia, and there's a lot of different, the what they try to do to alter when they're doing their runoff election in Georgia, and it didn't work, but they tried, and I think and we see what Ron DeSantis is doing down in Florida, which is a nightmare for my former state I used to live in, and a state my daughter lives in. So I'm very worried about the state of democracy down in Florida. So what do you see as some things that citizens can do over the next few years to try to continue in this fight that we've been in, well, for generations, but really hyper in since 2016?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So I'll start with what everyone should do at the federal level, no matter what state you live in, just because that's important too. And then I'll kind of break it down on how you can start the process of learning how you can get involved in your community. So again, it is important that our representatives, our senators are hearing from us. We were really fortunate that we had leaders in Congress in the last Congress that understood the threats facing our democracy and that were willing to prioritize those issues and champion them. And we need to make sure that we don't lose that momentum. So to be clear, 10 years ago, the policies that were in the For the People Act, things like restoration of voting rights, public financing of elections, they were not part of the Democratic Party platform. There were people championing that, Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Warren, but it wasn't something that every single Senate Democrat was signed on to. That was the result of tons of organizing and advocacy from people across the country. So we've actually come a really, really long way in building support, not just amongst voters, but actually amongst members of Congress over the past decade. So we cannot lose that. We cannot afford to lose any members of Congress and from this bill. So we need to make sure that folks are continuing to hear from us so that folks stay on, continue to be supportive, and that they do continue to prioritize democracy. When we did kind of enter the past previous Congresses, I think the past, three is, the For the People Act was HR 1 and S1, which signified that it was a top priority. So we need to make sure that it continues to be amongst the top priorities, along with the other issues that folks really care a lot about. So that advocacy is really, really important to your leaders, but then also good to talk to your friends and family about this as well. There's a lot of intersection between democracy and every other issues that folks care about, whether it's housing, affordable housing, or the cost of groceries, combating climate change, student loans. All of this, in order to address it, requires a democracy that is responsive and representative to the American people. So that means getting big money out of politics, enacting fair representation through banning partisan gerrymandering, and expanding and protecting the freedom to vote. So really want to highlight how important it is that we continue to build our movement by talking to our friends and families, outlining that intersection for democracy issues, and then continuing to advocate to members of Congress directly. So first off, definitely be sure that you're advocating at the federal level. Secondly, if you're interested in getting involved in your community, if you're, in New York, there's a lot of fantastic coalitions and organizations that you can plug into. The Let New York Vote Coalition has done an absolutely amazing job advocating for voting rights policies in New York State, as well as the Fair Elections Coalition that led on fair elections. Of course, we finally are at a moment where we have secured fair elections. The time is now for it to roll out. We need to make sure that implementation is smooth. So if you're based in New York, good to plug in. If you're in a state that's not New York, I would take a look and see what other organizations might be in your state or community that you can get involved with. There's fantastic organizations like All Voting is Local, Common Cause, and others that you can plug into. And if folks are interested in getting involved just kind of generally and learning more, you can visit the website of the coalition that I help co-run. It's called the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition, dfadcoalition.org. And I'll comment so folks can click on it. But there you can sign up to get email updates from the coalition on all things democracy. And we do try to amplify what's happening on the ground in states and communities across the country to folks that are based in those communities. So I guess to recap, make sure you're talking to your friends and family, make sure you're contacting your federal legislators, find an organization in your community to get involved with. And if you need help through that process and want to learn more, you can check out our website, dfadcoalition.org, sign up for updates, and we can directly email you so you can learn more about what's happening in your community and the federal level.
So you and I have done a few remembrances now of January 6th. And, when we've done them, we do them at the federal building, and it's, during the day. But I think it's important that we advocate for it. But why do you think it's important to continue to talk about the January 6th insurrection? And what are you seeing on the federal level that either gives you hope or doesn't give you hope, regarding this? Because I know I don't believe that this was a one-off. I think that there's some real problems with political violence out there based on rhetoric that has been, fomenting in the body politic for 20 years now, and now come to a head. So what are your thoughts on that? Why is it important to continue to remember? And what do you think we should do to either safeguard or or are you seeing some hope going on right now? And it's okay if it's not, because we got to be honest.
Sure. We have hope, but we also have continued issues, to be frank. But the reason that we have to continue lifting up what happened on January 6th is because the damage done from that day, first off, it was not just a singular day, this threat that we're discussing. It was a planned conspiracy amongst Trump and his allies, and a broader set of legislators and of political operatives that didn't just act that day. They spread lies about the 2020 election. The big lies, folks know it, spread misinformation, and really intentionally, in a variety of different ways, tried to obstruct the election results. And we cannot let that go. There still hasn't been enough accountability. There still hasn't been accountability for Trump specifically for January 6th. And one piece of hope that I would highlight is we have had an important reform passed as a result of what happened on January 6th, and that's the Electoral Count Reform Act. So that was one of the main kind of concerns that day, is it was not clear in the Constitution the process for certifying the election results. The Electoral Count Act put into law what has been kind of tradition for the past years. But as many things in the Trump presidency, it was one of those things where we realized that we're relying a lot on precedent and not on law, and that we cannot do that when we have bad actors like Donald Trump and others who could fill those roles and abuse abuse that kind of lack of legal binding. So the Electoral Count Reform Act is a huge win. That's really exciting. It was passed in a bipartisan way. So that is a ray of light. But as I mentioned, the threats continue. That's why we need to continue to talk about it. Not only is it the threat of misinformation and the big lie that is sowing mistrust in our elections, but it's also resulting in a mistrust of election officials, and fueling extremism, to be honest. This past election, I was kind of in a loop with folks on the ground and, across the country that had reported out different really disturbing circumstances that were happening around threats to election workers, as well as, threats to voters. In Phoenix, there were folks that showed up to the polls with AR-15s. And I'll shout out the League of Women Voters that engaged in a lawsuit that forced those individuals to leave the premises, and had a restraining order from the polls from those folks. But that, that extremism, there's a root cause. It's because there are people like Donald Trump and allies that are, essentially tricking people into believing that the election was stolen. And those people, those, political operatives that are spreading these lies, they know they are lies. But the folks that are absorbing this information don't necessarily know that they are lies. They are taking what they're saying at face value. And, essentially, many of their colleagues, their, Republican colleagues are, although they may not be big lie proponents, they're being complicit. So that's why we need this accountability, because we cannot tolerate this misinformation that we know is fueling extremism and resulting in threats to election workers, that is resulting in mass quitting of election workers across the country. And also, we generally want people to feel safe. Even, this summer, I heard from 2 secretaries of states that they had threats against them because of the election. So if those folks, secretaries of states, are getting these threats, what does this say for everyone else involved in our elections? We need to make sure folks are protected, and elected officials are really, really important to making sure our election runs smoothly. So that's why it's important that we keep highlighting it. We need to continue to be advocating for accountability and, again, policies that can protect our democracy from these threats.
Yeah, it's very important that we have to continue that. I mean, I do think that there is some hope out there. One of the things that I took out of this last election is many or almost all of the election deniers lost. Mm-hmm. And so the public did finally seem to bring a consequence to them. And I also saw that when they did lose, most of the election deniers, moved on and did not claim fraud and decided, to accept the election results, which kind of shows that it was all a mummer's farce to begin with, and they were trying to, play to a base. And then when they lost, they didn't want the stigma of that on them, and they moved on. They didn't really believe the election liar, except for Carrie Lake, who continues her craziness and in Arizona, and but again, the public rejected her. So that I'll take some solace in. But I do see that the public has kind of moved on from the insurrection. It's almost like because it wasn't successful, they almost kind of like are, well, yeah, some people are going to jail, and and they're chasing another flashy, shiny thing, and they don't realize that building a case against a former president is not going to be something you can do in like a month. And so they moved on, and yet, we're at the time of recording this program, there's news that there's some imminent action coming out of Georgia, that there's and I'm really scared that if an indictment comes, there will be violence, and that is not a reason not to indict, but it is something that we have to live with, and it's not something that we ever thought we would have to live with.
Yeah, it's terrifying, the fact that now we're in this new era where we have to think about that's reality. But I agree with you that I think that this, at least in November, was something that was top of mind for folks, democracy kind of more broadly. And that does give me hope that they did, the general public mostly rejected those big lie candidates. And not only is that a great sign for, where the American public stands on these issues, but we dodged a bullet because a lot of those candidates were running for governor, secretary of state, states that, these states and roles where they could actually be the deciding factor and are we sending an alternate slate of electors? And thankfully we dodged that. So that's, and passed the Electoral Count Act, so that's helpful. One thing that I thought was surprising when we were looking at different polls from the election is folks probably remember tons of headlines around democracy, threats to democracy being something that voters really, really cared about. And there's some polling that shows that it was number 2 on their list, and with some folks ranking it above inflation. When you asked what was threatened, what was the main threat to our democracy, you would think it would have been January 6th or the big lie, but it was actually corruption and money in politics, which I thought was very surprising. But, there's an intersection there is there's a lot of secret money that is funding this kind of anti-democratic movement. And we've been doing a lot of research and kind of reporting on that. There actually were several secret money groups that raised and spent large sums of money to actually bus people into the insurrection and to do kind of robocalls to recruit folks to join. So folks are not far off when they're saying that corruption and secret money in politics are a really, really big threat to our election. And we actually found out a couple of weeks ago from reporting, because unfortunately we don't have disclosure requirements really in the United States for secret money groups, that the Heritage Foundation spent $5 million to defeat the For the People Act. So just discovered that a couple of weeks back. So it is interesting that the public, and it's not new, the public, when you ask them around threats to our democracy, they almost always say corruption and big money. And that's why most candidates, they, run on, I'm going to get big money out of politics. And that doesn't always translate to them doing something about it. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it is interesting that that folks are thinking more along the lines of that as a threat rather than January 6th. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the new January 6th committee, which is going to have a very different tact, and I think it's going to focus a lot more on Hunter Biden and his laptop. But it'll be interesting to see what the new House majority does with that platform. We all did watch as the House Democrats had these very high profile hearings that everyone I know watched and tuned in, and were almost like a soap opera. And I think that's one of the reasons why people were talking about it so much, in addition to just the shock factor, is they were just really compelling and shocking. I don't see that happening in this new Congress, but we'll be keeping a close eye on whatever they're doing with that platform if they do happen to talk about January 6th and try to promote their own propaganda about that day.
Yeah, I mean, there probably won't be a January 6th commission like there was in the House, but having that extra senator in the Senate really makes a big deal about what they can do, because now the committees aren't equal. You don't have to get permission to do subpoenas. The party in power can actually act like the party in power. So there's some interesting things there. Well, we're getting near the end of how long I like to keep these. And what I like to ask at the end is, what haven't we talked about? Here's your chance to talk about something that we haven't been able to talk about, any issue whatsoever, and just or something that you want to lift up or re-emphasize. Here's your job. Go.
Thanks, Dustin. I think I'd love to just continue to lift up the importance of being vocal on these issues and of being consistent in taking action. I imagine a lot of the folks that are listening to this Zoom are based in New York. We have the ear of the leader of the Senate. That's a really, really valuable place to be in. Also, I'm sure folks, are able to get plugged into their local community. There's things that we can do at the local level and at the state level to continue advocating. But it's really, really important that we continue to be vocal on these issues. And there's tons of ways to do so. Write a letter to the editor, call your representative, talk to your friends and family around these issues. That's really important that we don't lose momentum, even though it can be discouraging looking at the news and seeing what's happening across the country and seeing a lot of this disinformation that's going on. But I'm inspired, because my job is to work with folks across the country on these issues. And I consistently see folks showing up, advocates, organizations, members of Congress that are still, championing this legislation. I'll be really excited to see, what the Senate does this year. I imagine they'll have some really exciting, kind of high profile hearings and votes that could be an opportunity to get folks on record. So just want to encourage folks, continue to be involved, stay vocal, and stay involved in the fight, because it's important and we need to keep moving.
Well, Christine, thank you again for coming on Zoom with Czarny. Thank you for being a friend and a democracy advocate. And I really think you do incredible work and important work. And thank you for fighting for all the people.
Thanks so much, Dustin.
And that was my interview with Christine Wood of Public Citizen. It was a great interview. Thank you so much for coming on, Christine. And next week, I will be doing Commissioner in a Car on Tuesday. We'll be talking about changing your party day. That's coming up on February 14th. But next week, we'll be talking about how to change your party in New York and the deadline to doing that, which is February 14th, Valentine's Day, or as I like to say, fall in love with your party day. And then we will also, on next Thursday, I'll be talking to Daniel Brecker of Empire State Indivisible. We'll be having a discussion about the New York State budget and what Indivisible's work is in New York and what they're focusing on down in the city, but also throughout all of New York State. And then finally, my weekly wonk is continuing on Sundays. Last Sunday, I did a look at the towns of Onondaga. This Sunday, I will be doing the city of Syracuse and taking a quick look at the city of Syracuse as well, as we're getting ready for the redistricting that's happening for county ledge and common councils. That's not going to be in next week's article or this weekend's article, but it will be coming soon as I have the data to share with you, which is shortly. So enjoy. Remember to go to DustinCzarny.com to subscribe. You can get all my content and election news updates. I hope, it's always for free. I do this all on my own. I never take any money for it. I pay for it all out of my own pocket. It's way I believe is my public information that I have in this role as your Democratic Elections Commissioner in Onondaga County. So enjoy, and I hope to see you around. Bye-bye.